All right, we're on YouTube and continuing on in our Bible study today. Welcome to anybody who's watching by YouTube at this particular moment, or anyone who will be watching at another point in time during the remainder of the week. We're glad that you're taking advantage of this opportunity to join us for Bible study time. We've been in the book of Acts for several months now. We're closing in on the end of the book of Acts. We're in that last part of the story of Acts, the last half of Acts, telling us the story of Paul and his ministry, its beginnings, and the various places it went. And so we've finished up with the missionary aspects of Paul's work. We're in those last stages of his life, literally, the last years, the years where he is in imprisonment, where he's waiting to go to Rome, where he will have his final trial before the authorities in Rome at some point. As we said before, we don't really know what happens. Paul is on the way to Rome as the book of Acts closes, and so we don't really know what happens to Paul after that, other than that he ended up in Rome and that he died at some point in Rome. But anyway, we don't get to know any of that kind of information. It's not present for us in the book of Acts. We're in chapter 24 and going to be reading into chapter 25. We are going through a pretty intense travel log that Luke provides about the different things that are happening to Paul as he is in imprisonment. Remember that he went to Jerusalem under compulsion of the Holy Spirit. Everybody was afraid that when he went to Jerusalem, he was going to get arrested or get persecuted or get killed. And all those things have come true. He would have been killed had it not been for God's intervention through the Romans. He got dragged before the Sanhedrin and would have been killed, except that the Roman leader intervened and set about several trials before Roman authorities because Paul is a Roman citizen. So we're in the middle of all those trials. Paul, because Plautus found out that Paul is going to be ambushed and killed by the Jews, Paul has been transported to Caesarea under Roman guard, away from Jerusalem into Caesarea under Roman guard to come before the governor at that time, whose name is Felix, and that's where we pick up the story here in chapter 24 today. You have before you, those who are here, you have before you the notes and the text for our study today. So we'll pick up a reading those opening verses in chapter 24. 5 days later, that is 5 days after Paul was brought to Caesarea, 5 days later, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and an attorney, a certain Tertullus, and they reported their case against Paul to the governor. This is the trial that the tribune back in Jerusalem had sent Paul to Caesarea to be tried by Felix, and this is the trial taking place. When Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, "Because of you, most excellent Felix, we have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight. In every way and in everywhere, we welcome this with utmost gratitude. But to detain you no further, I beg you to hear us briefly with your customary graciousness." He's laying it on pretty thick, isn't he? "We have in fact found this man a pestilent fellow, an agitator," speaking of Paul, "among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazareans." You can hear the sneer in his voice as he's saying these things, don't you? "He even tried to profane the temple, so we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn from him concerning everything of which we accuse him." The Jews also joined in the charge by asserting that all this was true. So we got the first part of the trial right here, the case being prosecuted against Paul by the Sanhedrin. That's the highest council in the Jewish leadership circles. including the high priest Ananias. Remember, Paul was brought before the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, and that didn't go over so well. Nothing was decided there. And in fact, after that meeting with the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, that's when the plot to kill him was concocted. And when it was found out, that's why the tribune in Jerusalem had Paul taken to Caesarea for trial before Felix. So here's the first half of it. Tertullus is the name of this guy. He's an attorney. And don't think in the same terms of an attorney today. I mean, attorneys in our day have to do with our civil laws. The attorney, the lawyers, whenever you see that word in the biblical context, has to do with the law of Moses and has to do with living under the law of Moses primarily. Doesn't mean that they're not versed in the other laws of the people, but their primary concern is with the laws of Moses and making presentations before the Romans. When they took that outside the boundaries of just the Jewish laws. Tertullus is, again, he's called an attorney, a lawyer, a spokesman, an orator. He is a slick guy. I was thinking the movie Anatomy of a Murder. Jimmy Stewart's in it. He plays a small town Michigan lawyer. And he's actually defending somebody who's been accused of murder. But anyway, the prosecution brings in a guy from, they're in small town Michigan, so they bring in somebody from the state capitol, to help carry out the case. Somebody who's, really slick and has all the polish and all that kind of stuff. That's what Tertullus is. He's a guy to impress. And so he is all that together: an attorney, a spokesman, an orator. He's the right guy to present the case. They're really hoping to nail this thing down, to get Paul convicted, and they're hoping to get him killed. Again, profaning the temple is a crime punishable by death in the Jewish tradition. And there were instances where the Romans would allow the Jews to carry that out on their own. You bring in the big gun. We're going to take him down. We're bringing in the big gun. It has all the feel of that, which again helps us to see that Paul is really in kind of a David and Goliath kind of situation. Paul is David. The Jews are Goliath. Remember the Roman authorities. Their main concern is keeping the peace, and they got to deal with all the Jewish leaders all the time. And they're willing to give, but they're also willing to take if they need to in order to maintain the peace. That's their main issue. And so they want to give a lot of leeway. They want to give where they can give. The whole thing with Jesus and Pilate, Jesus was a nobody. And giving Jesus to the crowds was no big deal ultimately. So they want to cater to the Jewish people as much as possible just to keep the peace. It's not because they loved them. It's not because they necessarily respected them. It's because they just wanted to keep the peace. So Felix, as the governor, has that sense of things, but he's also dealing with Paul, who is very aware that he is a Roman citizen and that they have to do right by him. Because the Roman citizens could not be they could not be convicted unless they had a fair trial. And so that's Felix's conundrum. He's caught between the two issues. So the Jews make their case. They laid out against Paul, and the main issue for them has to do with profaning the temple. Now, it's interesting to me as I was thinking about this and just thinking about Tertullus and how he's so fawning. He just really does lay it on thick with Felix. The Jews hated the Romans. They didn't want the Romans over them. Within several years' time, they're going to be leading an insurrection against the Romans, and going to be, the temple's going to be destroyed again, and the people are going to be rounded up and routed because of their opposition to the Romans, and that's what the Romans were always afraid of. All that stuff about We have long enjoyed peace, and reforms have been made for this people because of your foresight in every way and everywhere. We welcome this with utmost gratitude. That's baloney. They didn't love the Romans, and they weren't grateful for any of that. And if they could have thrown off the Romans tomorrow, they would have done it. But that's what you do. You're playing the game, and Felix expects that. We know later on in the course of this passage, Luke tells us that Felix is expecting Paul to offer him a bribe. You know how things work. And if you want to get things, to play your way, well, show me how much you want me to help you out here. So you've got, this is the Gentile world of power, and it made me think of Jesus' teaching. I've got it in that paragraph there at the top of the second page. You remember Jesus' teaching. He had the disciples come, and he had James and John angling for positions of power when the kingdom came in, and he gives this teaching to them. You know that those who are supposed to rule over the Gentiles lord it over them. They play all of these power games, and their great men exercise authority over them, which means they oppress them if they can. It's all about getting the power and using it against your opponents somehow. That's how the world works. But it shall not be so among you, says Jesus to his disciples. You are to become servants to others. You are to bow down before others. You are to seek to serve them. You are to be humble. You're not to play the game the way the Gentiles do. Well, we see how the Gentiles play the game in this little episode here. We see what's expected in this particular interchange. We go to the next set of scripture verses there on the bottom of the second page. When the governor motioned him to speak, Paul replied, I cheerfully make my defense, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this people, that is Felix. As you can find out, it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone in the temple or stirring up a crowd either in the synagogue or throughout the city. Neither can they prove to you the charge that they now bring against me, which is profaning the temple. But this I admit to you, that according to the way, that is according to the church of Jesus Christ, that was the name for the church at that point, according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors, believing everything laid down according to the law or written in the prophets. I have a hope in God, a hope that they themselves also accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, I do my best always to have a clear conscience toward God and all the people. Now, after some years, I came to bring alms to my people and to offer sacrifices. While I was doing this, they found me in the temple completing the rite of purification without any crowd or disturbance. But there were some Jews from Asia. They ought to be here before you to make an accusation, if they have anything against me. Or let these men here tell what crime they have found when I stood before the council, unless it was this one sentence that I called out while standing before them. It is about the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. But Felix, who was rather well informed about the way, adjourned the hearing with the comment, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Then he ordered the centurion to keep him in custody, that is, to keep Paul in custody, but to let him have some liberty and not to prevent any of his friends from taking care of his Paul's defense. He's not playing the game that Tertullus played. He's not going to lay it on thick. But he is going to give a defense, and he's going to do it in a very positive and winsome sort of fashion. Paul's defense, centers around, first, the fact that, he's not an enemy of the Jews. He's not an enemy of the Jewish way. In fact, what Paul is trying to do is to lead the other Jews into the full knowledge of the Jewish way. Jesus is the Messiah. He is the fulfillment of everything that God has been up to with the Jews from the very start all the way till now. What he's doing, the way he's putting it here and the way he sees it, I'm sure, he's leading them into the fullness of the faith. He's not denigrating the faith. He's not denying the faith, and he's certainly not showing disrespect to it. He's simply trying to show them, to convince them that Jesus is the end of the Jewish faith. Jesus is the goal of the Jewish faith. And so he's saying, I haven't done anything. I'm not denigrating my people. I'm not profaning the temple. I love my people. I love my heritage. I love my tradition. Without saying it, what he's saying is we just have a difference of opinion about where that ends up. I believe it ends up in Jesus Christ, and they say it doesn't. And so that's the issue. I'm not an enemy to my faith. I'm actually a champion of the faith, is what he's saying in so many words. You can check it out. There are plenty of witnesses around. Much more, you know us. You know the history. You know the church. And you've seen all this take place, he's saying to Felix. So you know what the truth is. So he makes a very persuasive case. He's defending the church. He's defending what he's been about, and he says, "I'm not guilty of the charge that they have made against me." And you can check it out. Ask anybody around, and you know enough to know who to ask to find out. So he's really put Felix in a bind. Felix again wants to cater to the Jewish interest to keep the peace, but he knows that Paul's innocent. And he really should acquit Paul, but he doesn't want to anger the Jews. So what does he do? He punts. We'll decide this later on. We'll wait for Lysias to come down. Lysias was the tribune back in Jerusalem who had sent Paul to Caesarea in the first place. He said, we'll wait for him to come and he can fill in the gaps. That's the last we hear of Lysias. He has nothing to do with this. This is completely a stall tactic. Keeps Paul under arrest, both for his safety as well as for the pacification of the Jews. But he gives Paul a lot of liberty. It's going to be 2 years that Paul sits in this temporary state in Caesarea. Because Felix refuses to render a judgment. He doesn't want to make anybody mad. I've got a little paragraph there at the end of that section of comment on the fourth page there, third or fourth. This is not a new thing, right? Felix is kind of playing the same role that Pilate played. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, but Pilate didn't want to deal with the unruly crowds, and so he just gave Jesus up. He wasn't interested in justice. He was interested in maintaining the peace, however false that peace was. Felix is basically doing the same thing. Well, how many leaders have ever done that? How many leaders are willing to put their jobs on the line to do what's right? How many will sacrifice their livelihood for the sake of seeing justice done? That's an age-old problem, and we deal with it today. And not only do we deal with it at our governmental level, we deal with it in our churches, and we deal with it in our families, and we deal with it in our businesses. I mean, it's at every level. It takes courage to do what is right. We talked about that on Sunday. It takes a lot of courage to do what is right. It will cost you to do what is right many times, and most of us don't want to pay that cost. We like to carp about the leaders in our government who won't do what's right and who chicken out of things. We're just as bad at our own level in so many ways as well. So we see highlighted here, an age-old problem, and the fact of the matter is that few of us really want to lay it all on the line to see the right thing get done many times. It takes courage to stand up for what is right and true. Continue on in that next section of verses, kind of sums up the matter. Some days later, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, he sent for Paul and heard him speak concerning faith in Christ Jesus. And as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present. When I have opportunity, I will send for you." At the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, and for that reason, he used to send for him very often and converse with him. Again, the bribe, the bribe, the bribe. After 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and since he wanted to grant the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Just says everything we've just been saying. The interesting thing, Paul, 2 years, Paul is left hanging. What does Paul do? He sits around in his jail cell and he twiddles his thumb and he worries? No. Paul stays busy. Now, of course, he's not in a jail cell. He's under house arrest, literally. And so he's able, as we saw in the last set of verses, he's able to have friends come and go. He's able to carry out correspondence. There's some speculation as to which one of the letters of Paul were written from Caesarea when he was in prison there. One scholar that I was looking at has speculated that Philippians may have been written from Caesarea. You read the first chapter in Philippians, and you see Paul acknowledge that he's in jail, and he doesn't know how things are going to turn out. So that might be well the case. But he's in Caesarea. He's not just sitting around doing nothing. He's continuing his ministry as best he can. He's going to be waiting there for 2 years, and so he continues to carry out his ministry. At the same time, though, that 2-year wait certainly had to have tried his faith. Go back to chapter 23, verse 11. After he's had that roundabout nasty time with the Jews, God comes to him by the Spirit and says, stay of good courage. The road doesn't end here. You're going to end up in Rome testifying on behalf of the gospel there. So Paul has a sense that he's headed to Rome, but now he's waiting 2 years. And he's anxious, the one side of him, he's anxious to show that he is being truthful, that he wants to be vindicated for his truthfulness, but he's got to wait. He's waiting for God to carry out his work. He knows God's appointed him to go to Rome, but he's got to wait for it to play out. And he doesn't know necessarily exactly how that's going to happen. Many times God makes us wait while he carries out his work in our lives, while he carries out his plans for us as his people, as churches, as individuals, as various sorts of groups. We want everything done now. As soon as we know what's going to happen, as soon as we believe this is going to happen, we want it to be done tomorrow. And then it takes 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. Remember Abraham, the promise. You're going to have a child, and through that child, the whole world will be blessed. 25 years later, finally, the child comes. A lot of the Christian life is waiting for God to bring about what he has said he will do. That's not easy stuff. And surely Paul dealt with his own struggle at some point or way. Last section of scripture passages there, we carry the story forward into chapter 25. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Festus is the successor to Felix. Felix has been called to some other position somewhere. Festus comes in. 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up from Caesarea to Jerusalem. You always go up to Jerusalem in the biblical language. You never go down. Jerusalem is the high point. He went up there where the chief priests and the leaders of the Jews gave him a report against Paul. Certainly Festus went up for other matters than this Paul thing, but while he's up there, he's got to deal with this Paul thing too. It's still hanging out there. And you know that the Jews are, when they see that Felix is gone, they're going to hit up Festus first thing and say, we've got to take care of this matter right now, pronto. They appealed to him, that is the Jews, and requested as a favor to them against Paul to have him transferred to Jerusalem. Just bring him back here and we can settle this thing on our own. We'll take care of it. Yeah, exactly. They will take care of it. They were in fact planning an ambush to kill him along the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, he said, let those of you who have the authority come down with me, and if there's anything wrong about the man, let them accuse him. You come on to Caesarea and we'll have a trial. We'll get to the bottom of this. We'll take care of this. Surely they complained about Felix and him kind of leaving things hanging. And Festus, I'm told from the commentaries, is young. He's just starting out. He's Barney Fife in his first position, right, as sheriff. And so he's licking his chops to fix things up, right? Verse 6, after he had stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he had other things to do besides dealing with this Paul issue, he went down to Caesarea. The next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he arrived, the Jews who had gone down from Jerusalem surrounded him, bringing many serious charges against him which they could not prove. I wonder if they brought Tertullus with them this time or not. They doesn't say anything about that. I would imagine that Tertullus was brought in with Felix because Felix was a more seasoned leader, and this would play into the fact that Festus was a young guy, so they could just shoot straight from the hip with him. Verse 8, Paul said in his defense, I have in no way committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple or against the emperor. So they make their case against Paul the same case. Paul makes the same defense. Verse 9, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, again, the favor, he asked Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and be tried there before me on these charges? Paul said, I am standing before the emperor's tribunal. This is where I should be tried. I have done no wrong to the Jews, as you very well know. Now, if I am in the wrong and have committed something for which I deserve to die, I am not trying to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can turn me over to them. I appeal to the emperor. Then Festus, after he had conferred with his council, replied, you have appealed to the emperor you will go. If Paul had gone back to Jerusalem, the Sanhedrin would have been able to have its way, even if he did make it to the trial, which he probably wouldn't have. Remember the conspiracy, the Jews who were plotting to kill him, and they wouldn't eat or drink until they had done the deed. Even if he got there safely, he would have lost. And Paul knows this. And he's basically saying, if I'm guilty, tell me right now and let's get on with this. But if I'm not guilty, I'm not going back to Jerusalem so they can have a kangaroo court and crucify me. I'm going to the emperor. And that was his right to appeal, to go to the emperor. And so that's what he does. I'm going to the emperor. I want to take my case higher. If you won't settle the issue, I want to go to a court that's higher that can settle the issue. And so Festus, probably glad to be rid of this conundrum, said, okay, you've appealed to the emperor, you will go. And so Paul finally is going to be heading to Rome, and finally will carry on the work that God has for him to do there. But there's some intervening stuff before he gets there, including a trip that's a heck of a trip to Rome. I'm sorry? The emperor? We do, but I don't right now. I can't pull it to my mind. I could go look it up real quick and tell you. I don't know which emperor. We'll talk about that in the next, yeah. By the time Paul is there, it's Nero who's in charge. And, or at least by the time he's there the second time. And that's the debate, how long was he in Rome? And, suppose that he was in Rome, had a trial, was acquitted, went and did missionary work, and then was arrested again and brought to Rome, and Nero put him to death. Because Nero, was trying to blame everything on the Christians, or at least part of everything on the Christians. So Nero is the one under whom he died, we believe. But I'm not sure which emperor was the one before Nero. Thoughts, questions, comments? All right. For those who are watching by YouTube, we will not be meeting next Wednesday. Have a happy 4th of July. You all have a happy 4th of July. But come on Sunday. We're here Sunday morning for worship as the norm.